Hello. I have previously done a video on how to debrief a DISC report, behaviours report, or at least how I debrief a report. And I'd like to do the same for you today on driving forces. So, as you can see there on the screen, we have three things I want to talk about. How one prepares for a driving force debrief, the conversation flow, the steps that you should go through as part of the debrief, and then the actual debrief itself. I'll actually walk through not all of a debrief, but one piece of each piece if you wish, so that you can see how it's done. We don't need to walk through every single piece of it. So let's start with the preparation. When you start to prepare for a debrief, we use the model developed by Trevor O'Sullivan in TTI in Australia called Big Little Big. And the idea behind this is that you are prepared, that you're not going into the debriefing winging it, that you've thought through what you want to do in the actual debriefing, where you want to focus attention, what questions you want to ask, what points you want to make, and so on. So, to start, let's look at big. So you look at somebody's report and you ask yourself the question, what stands out, what jumps out in their profile? And typically I start by looking at the continuum. And I ask myself the question, as I say, what's big? What jumps out? So the things that jump out here clearly are, number one, the primary cluster. What's the primary cluster here? And the primary cluster, you can see, is resourceful, intentional, commanding, and receptive. Here are the top four on the continuum. And so that's the first thing that I suppose one observes when one looks at that. And so we know that resourceful in this case is looking for a return on time, energy, and money. So if I look at resourceful, for example, people are driven by practical results, maximising both efficiency and returns for their investment of time, talent, energy, and resources. Intentional people who are driven to assist others for a specific purpose, not just for the sake of being helpful or supportive. Receptive people who are driven by new ideas, methods, and opportunities that fall outside the defined system for living. And commanding, I have here people who are driven by status, recognition, and control over their personal freedom. So I now know I have an idea of the profile of this individual: resourceful, intentional, receptive, commanding. And typically I try and craft a statement that sort of encapsulates, if you wish, those four driving forces in the primary cluster. So I achieve freedom and control over my destiny, commanding. By working with people, intentional, on new opportunities, receptive, that give me a return on my time, energy, money, resourceful. So I achieve freedom and control over my life by working with people on new opportunities that give return on my time, energy, and money. So when you look at this, you see that's a clear statement of who this person is. These are actually my driving forces. So it gives a clear idea of what to look at when you look at me. That's the first big thing. The pattern, how extreme are the patterns. It is worth making the point that when you look at this, you may look and say, what other patterns are there? So intellectual higher than instinctive, objective more than harmonious. So you can see here how a resourceful person, you can imagine them being objective as well, functionality over form. And again, when you see the command here, very high score, you see 0 collaborative, see resourceful 100, 0 selfless. So you get a sense as well there of the pattern of what's actually going on. Looking at the areas of awareness is really, really important. And I do this always at the beginning to see, is there anything that I need to be aware of? You're familiar with this, looking at the areas of awareness, the population distribution, the mean, and then 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, 3 standard deviations from that mean. So looking at that is really, really important. When I look at the questions that I want to ask, I'm not looking just at the primary cluster, and situational and different cluster. I'm also looking at how extreme or otherwise are they. And I see it here quite clearly that there are scores that are really way out there, well above the population norm. So it gives me another indication not only of the primary cluster and if you wish, the overall view of the person, but also how far removed they are from the population norms. So for example, somebody could have the exact same 4 primary cluster here, but all be mainstream. They could have those, their top 4, but be very middle of the road. So they're not going to be very extreme. This would be their driving force. This was what engaged them and so on and so forth. But it won't be that obvious to everybody. It won't be sort of in your face. Whereas somebody who has a very, very extreme driving force vis-a-vis the population norm will come across as being much stronger. When we look at the driving forces, we then go down, we look at the little. And what's little here? And for each of the cluster, in the primary cluster, for each, we describe the score. And then what questions do I want to ask? And this is really important. So we've 3 questions and a couple of comments. The first question is goal value. What's the goal? What is this person seeking to achieve, and what's important to them? The second question really is what energizes them, what engages them and excites them. And the third one is what frustrates them. So let's have a look at this questioning formula and just pop in here for a moment. The driven by statement, like what drives them? The goal statement, the value statement, the engaged by statement, the frustrated by statement, the extended statement, and the influenced by statement. So coming up with these is really, really important, like doing this exercise in advance so that you can look at. So for example, to be ready for your client, to be prepared for the debriefing, you want to prepare the following questions and come up with your answers. Well, if you understand what I mean, come up with the statements. Obviously, the answer is going to come from the client. So, how does it impact your engagement or connection when? And you put in a value statement. How does it impact your engagement or connection when? And you put in a goal statement. How important is, and you put in an energized statement, to you and why? How does it impact you when people, situations overemphasize, i.e. this is the frustration by? And have you ever been in a situation where you have, and this is the overextension, how important is and influenced by to you and why? So these are the questions, the primary questions that you're asking somebody to try and understand what's going on for them. And we look at that in a few minutes and how that actually plays out when we actually look at the engagement and the goal and the value statements around each one of them. So you prepare these questions, and it'll be clearer to you in a few minutes. We prepare these questions and we have them ready in advance. You may or may not use them, but at the very least it will have you prepared to ask appropriate questions to help the person understand the driving force and understand the impact that it has on them and how important this why is to them. Typically, I then do the exact same exercise for situational and indifferent with a variation. So in the case of situational here, what I'm looking at really is I'm looking at ask myself the question, what kind of environment might cause a situational driving force to come into play? Or when might a situational driving force come into play to support a primary driving force? And the case of the indifferent driving force is really all I'm looking for there is awareness. Be aware of the following. So if I'm looking at a very, very low score in the indifferent area, I'm looking at people who are scoring like me, who are scoring 0 on some things. I think, whoa, be aware. What does this mean? Be aware of this because people will notice this and it will stand out. And when I've that exercise done in my preparation, I've all these questions ready, I've gone through it, I've now a really good understanding. I go back and I look at big again and I ask myself the last question here in big, have a re-look and say, anything new, anything jump up at me, anything that I didn't think of before that I want to think of now or that comes to mind now, some other little insight I may have. So that's the approach to preparation, and you'll understand exactly that questioning process, you'll understand that exactly when we look at the actual debrief itself in a few minutes. In terms of the conversation flow really has a few simple steps to it. And actually I could actually probably consolidate the two of these here and say the first area that you focus on in the conversation is building rapport and establishing purpose. So you can say to somebody, why are we here today? What are we hoping to get out of this? You're trying to put them at ease. You're trying to explain to them that there's no good or bad, there's no right or wrong. What we're getting here is information, interesting, useful information that can help us understand more clearly why you do what you do, what engages, what disengages you, what excites you, what energizes you, what would be easy for you to do because it motivates you, and so on and so forth. So we're having this conversation and we're just throwing these things into the mix, if you wish, to prepare them and relax them and get them ready. And really important though on the purpose, really important to understand why they're here, what they're hoping to accomplish from this exercise, and they have that clear in their own minds. Once that's done and the person's relaxed and they're ready to rock and roll, if you wish, I then build the model. And again, we'll do that in a moment. I'll show you how I do that. There's a video on this already, as you know, on the model, but I'm going to do it again because I want to do it just a little bit differently this time round. Then, having done that, built the model, the person now understands why they're here, they're relaxed, they understand the model, the driving force model, and then you look at the person's scores and you describe each score and you identify the primary cluster, you ask the questions, and when you've done all that and gone through it, you may then look at the situational and indifferent as appropriate. So that's the conversation flow. The third area I want to look at is the debrief. So we start by building the model. And we draw it very simply like this. And then we insert and explain to them the idea of the 6 areas that we're measuring. Just like we talk about a DISC, we talk about DIS and C, people. And here we talk about the knowledge, utility, surroundings, others, power and methodologies. And when we've built out this model, we then explain the idea that for these 6 areas that we're measuring, there's a continuum. So for example, in the case of knowledge and learning in this spectrum, we have 2 ends to the spectrum. We have instinctive on one side and intellectual on the other side. And once we've done that and we work through our way through that, for utility we go and look at utility and we talk about resourceful and selfless. We build it out just like this, where they can see the 6 spectrums expressed in terms of 12 driving forces. And then for each one of these we can start and explain it to them. So for example, we take intellectual and we talk about the goal for intellectual and the values and the energized by, the frustrated by. So for example, for intellectual, the goal is to expand their understanding and knowledge in all endeavours. They value breadth and depth of knowledge. They're energized by fully exploring new concepts and ideas, and they're frustrated by inability to advance their knowledge. And likewise, on the other side of the spectrum, for instinctive, we can talk about the goal being to seek knowledge relevant and useful to their current requirement, how the value is information as a direct application, how they can be energized by on-demand as-you-go learning mediums, and frustrated by purely theoretical discussions and activities. And likewise for the other one, so utility and application, in that spectrum we can talk about resourceful, their goal is to utilise and apply the resources to maximise return. They value maximising resource and minimising waste, and so on and so forth. And this can be done for each of the spectrums, all 6 spectrums. So now they understand all 12 driving forces. And this is a very, very simple approach. And when you do it, they really will understand. Say, yep, I get it, I understand it. We're measuring 6 areas. There's 2 ends to each spectrum. Just like we did in DISC, there are 2 ends to each spectrum. And here I am, and then you score. And you say something like, yep. And then you can see you're resourceful, you are commanding, you are receptive, and you are intentional, as in my case. And then you can identify the top 4 that are there. When you've done that, the person now understands the model and they're ready to start looking at their report. You will recall in the debriefing methodology I propose to you for DISC, that I use 2 pages. In DISC I looked at the continuum and the descriptors. In the case of driving forces I do something similar. I have the continuum and I have the norms. So let me show you those 2 pages. So looking here at the continuum, I can go to the individual, identify their primary, situational and indifferent driving forces, look at the scores that they got for each, ask them what they think that means. Is that a high, a middle or a low score? What implications that might have, and so on. I can have just a general conversation with them. I can help them to craft up the statement. So remember this statement that we prepared earlier? So I achieve freedom and control over my destiny, commanding, by working with people, intentional, on new ideas and opportunities, receptive, to achieve a return of my time, energy, money, resources. We can craft a statement like that with them. We can do that kind of exercise. Equally, we can look at the norm page. And in the norm page, we can see are there any extremes, any indifference, anything that are well outside, 3 standard deviations away from the norm that we want to perhaps pay attention to, or we can have that conversation with them around that. And then we take the primary these questions for the primary, situation and different clusters that we've prepared, and we look at each of the top 4, i.e. the primary driving forces, and we ask the questions. You recall we prepared them earlier. How does it impact your engagement or connection when? You bring the value, what that particular driving force values. So for example, just to give you a case in point, for me, and we're going to take resourceful in this particular case, I value maximising resources and minimising waste. So I could ask a question of the client: how does it impact your engagement or connection when you maximise resource and the opportunity to minimise waste? Or how does it impact your engagement or connection when, like with the goal word, you have the opportunity to utilise, apply resources to maximise return? Or how important is it, and I use the energize statement here, to attain measurable and practical results, and why might that be? And so on. So you can see here how we use these primary questions around the driving forces to elicit responses, to get the person to really understand, to really experience what's going on for them in the driving forces. Only then do I start looking at the report and looking at the text of the report. And typically, just like in the behaviours in DISC, I like people to go away then, having done that exercise with them, have them go away, have them review the report themselves and come up with their own insights using the debriefing guide, come up with their own insights into the report and bring them back for a second session and say, okay, what have you learned? What insights did you have? Share your thoughts with me. And then I try to consolidate you remember in the report there's a section that consolidates both behaviours and driving forces into one and says how they support each other or not, and gives you insights into how to manage, how to motivate and so on, given the driving forces and giving the behaviours. And I walk through that exercise with them. I try and identify some key areas that perhaps they may work at or that they want to be aware of, and that's pretty much the debrief of the driving forces complete.